Welcome to our first Gospel in our Christian Scriptures course, the Gospel of Mark. In this video, I'm taking you to Venice, the Piazza di San Marco, and the Basilica of St. Mark. You might ask, isn't Matthew the first Gospel in the New Testament? Why are we starting with Mark? Well, you might remember from our previous lessons that even though tradition had it for a long time to regard Matthew as the oldest gospel, scholars from the last 200 years agree that Mark is indeed the oldest. We will see in a little bit why most scholars believe that. But first, the four gospels have symbols. Mark is a lion, Matthew a human, Luke a bull, and John an eagle. And so you see the symbol of the lion over the entrance of the Basilica di San Marco in Venice. And also as the image for today's lesson. So let's jump into the Gospel of St. Mark. Who is Mark? We do not really know. Papias, who is a Greek apostolic father, he was the bishop of Hierapolis in today's Turkey, an author who lived around 60 to 130 CE, and an important early source on Christian oral tradition, and especially on the origins of the Gospels in the Bible, thought that Mark was Peter's translator, reading it this way in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. Mark is otherwise mentioned a number of times in the New Testament. He comes up in Acts chapter 12, verses 12 and 25, in Acts chapter 15, verses 37 and 39, where he is working with Barnabas and Saul, in Colossians 4, verse 10, where he is mentioned as the cousin of Barnabas, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11, where he is a co-worker of Paul and Luke, and in Philemon, verse 24, where he is named among Paul's co-workers. It is certainly possible that in all these passages the same Mark is mentioned. If this Mark is the writer of the Gospel, then he would have at least known Jesus, if not met Jesus during his lifetime. He would have first-hand knowledge about the life of Jesus. When was the Gospel of Mark written? Mark 13, verses 5 through 23 seem to suggest that a war is impending and that there are many people rising up claiming to be the Messiah. Indeed, we know that the first Jewish war from 67 to 73 CE that ended with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem started exactly because the Jewish people revolted, wanting to raise a new Messiah, an anointed one, a king of Israel, to establish a sovereign kingdom of Israel. The Gospel seems to anticipate this, which makes a dating around 65 CE very plausible. That would be shortly before the Jewish-Roman War started. What then is Mark's kerygma, its message? We could sum it up in one sentence: Jesus is the Messiah. That's Mark's contribution at a time when many people claim to be messiahs. He is trying to bring good news, which in Greek means euangelion, and which in English is translated to gospel. He's bringing good news to a troubled world. It was written from somewhere in the Roman Empire, probably to Gentile Christians. Here are a few characteristics of the Gospel of Mark. First, Mark is the shortest Gospel. It has only 16 chapters. It ends in the 16th chapter with verse 8 with these words: "And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." This was right after Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome had discovered the empty tomb with an angel inside who tells them that Jesus had been raised. They are charged to go and tell the disciples and Peter that Jesus will be going ahead of them to Galilee and that they will see him there. And that's when they are fleeing from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they say nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The end. Well, that's an odd ending to the story, right? What our listeners, and by the way, the Gospels were indeed intended to be read aloud to people, so people would hear it rather than read it. What are the listeners supposed to make out of the kind of ending? It's not really a happy ending, right? It kind of leaves open possibilities. They are going to see the living and raised Jesus, but there is no real conclusion. Well, that's the point of the original ending. People are now supposed to tell their stories about Jesus. How did they encounter the Christ? How did you encounter the Christ? How did the Messiah change their lives? How did the Messiah change your life? And so some younger manuscripts include some of these endings. There are two later endings in our Bibles. A shorter ending, chapter 16, verse 9, and the longer ending, chapter 16, 9 through 20. The second thing is the messianic secret. Jesus often tells those who recognize him as the Messiah not to tell anyone. Oftentimes it is the demons that recognize Jesus. There is a story right in the first chapter, verses 21 to 28. Here comes Jesus to Capernaum on the Sabbath and enters the synagogue where he taught. And here's what happens. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." Only the resurrection after Jesus was crucified would fully show that Jesus is the Messiah. That's why during his lifetime, Jesus tells people not to say anything. There is a slow revelation about Jesus being the Messiah as the gospel moves on. At the baptism in Mark 1, verse 11, only Jesus hears the voice of God. In Matthew and Luke, bystanders hear God's voice also. In the Transfiguration, in chapter 9, verse 7, only the disciples know but don't understand yet. At the crucifixion, in chapter 15, verse 39, the world knows in the words of the centurion, truly this man was God's Son. Jesus' kingship, the Messiahship, is revealed on the cross. The third thing in Mark is the immediacy. Everything is urgent in the Gospel of Mark. The word immediately comes up 27 times in Mark. By comparison, the longer Gospels make use of the word immediately much less. Matthew only 12 times, Luke 13, and John only 2. Already in the first chapter, we see how urgent everything is. Right after Jesus is baptized in the river Jordan, we hear, "And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness." That's where Jesus is tempted by the devil. When he comes back, he calls his first disciples. He passes along the Sea of Galilee and sees Simon Peter and his brother Andrew and tells them to follow. Verse 18, "And immediately they left their nets and followed him." Then he meets James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Again it says in verse 20, "Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him." Then they go on when Jesus heals a bunch of people. Eventually, Jesus heals a leper when we hear in verse 42, "Immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean." And as the text continues in the story of healing the leper, we see an example of the messianic secret. When Jesus compels the leper, telling him in verse 44, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourselves to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, a testimony to them." And all this was only in the first chapter, in only 45 verses. What a fast pace in the Gospel of Mark. In 45 verses, we have the opening of the Gospel, verse 1. John the Baptist, verses 2 through 8. Jesus' baptism, verses 9 through 11. Jesus' temptation, verses 12 through 13. Jesus calling his first disciples, verses 14 through 20. Jesus heals a man with an unclean spirit, 21 through 28. And Jesus heals many in Simon Peter's house, including Peter's mother-in-law, in 29 through 34. Jesus preaches in Galilee, 35 through 39. And finally, Jesus heals the leper, 40 to 45. Phew! What a pace! Mark is telling his audience that this mission to follow Jesus is urgent, especially now where there are so many people claiming that they are Messiah. It is urgent to proclaim that Jesus was already the true Messiah, and that it is up to the people in the audience to continue Jesus' mission of healing and concern for other people. And this mission is very urgent, because there is not much time left. Chapter 13. Terrible things will soon come. The temple will be destroyed, verses 1 through 8. There will be persecution, 9 through 13. When the time comes to the believers are to flee to the mountains, maybe the Masada, verses 14 through 23. And at that time, the Son of Man will come to judge the world, the final judgment day. Verses 24 through 27. The anticipation of terrible things is high, and they are coming soon in the form of the first Jewish-Roman war. Well, those are some things about the Gospel of Mark. Here's an interesting little tidbit. Mark is also seen as the founder of the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria in Egypt. The Pope of Alexandria, the head of the Coptic Church, is believed to be a successor of the Apostle Mark. The Coptic Church was the first church to split from the rest of Christianity after the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE. The split occurred over the difference in belief about the nature of Christ. While the Council of Chalcedon agreed that Jesus Christ had two natures, a human nature and a divine nature, and that was combined in one person, the Oriental Orthodox bishops, among them the Coptic Bishop of Alexandria, believed that Jesus had only one nature consisting of humanity and divinity. Yeah, I know. What's the big difference, right? Well, it was big enough for a disagreement that the first split of the church occurred in 451 CE, creating the Coptic Church as a separate church. If you're interested, there is a 3-minute and 51-second video about the Coptic Church in the rest of the lesson. So, you can now watch the Bible Project videos on the Gospel of Mark. If you want to spend some time, and this is not mandatory for the lesson, by the way, it's only if you are interested, you can listen to a dramatic reading of the entire Gospel of Mark by actor David Sochet in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. It is very dramatic to listen to and gives you a feeling for how the Gospel was supposed to be heard originally. We never get the chance to listen, actually. So it's interesting to listen to the entire Gospel and not just a part. It takes 2 hours. So if you want to do this, I recommend that you set aside a full 2 hours so you can truly listen to it. And it's pretty riveting reading of the Gospel of Mark. Enjoy, and we'll see you next time.